In today's video, we're going to be talking about generative AI artwork being used in Call of Duty and specifically Black Ops 6. We're going to be looking at it a bit more broadly than that, looking at how it's used in video games in general, and the kind of discussions and debates around that. How's it being used right now? What's the problems with it? And is there ever a way that generative AI could be used in a positive way in gaming? Heads up, this is a super long topic, so you might want to go grab a cup of tea before we get going. Now, I am going to say this at the start of the video because a lot of people on the last one started commenting a long while before they got to the end of listening to what I had to say. But I want to make it clear, I don't have a horse in this race. I don't think generative AI is amazing and should be used all the time, and I don't think generative AI is awful and should never be used. I agree that artists should be fairly compensated for their value and their work, but I also don't think that just because somebody declares that they're an artist, that entitles them to have some kind of compensation from society. I think the whole issue is super interesting and it's worth talking about. And I don't have a strong opinion on any one particular aspect of it. It's a tricky issue, and that's what makes it interesting. And hopefully we can get to the point one day in kind of social media and content creation where people can listen to a discussion or an explanation of a complicated topic without needing to be immediately polarized. You don't need to be for or against anything in here. I'm not saying anyone has done something wrong here. It's not that kind of video. I'm not trying to cause drama or rage bait, and you don't need to decide whether you're for or against anything in here. I did have someone in the last video accusing me of rage baiting, and I thought it's really weird because that last video about the voice actors being replaced was very much, hey, people are getting very angry about this and there's not really a need to get angry about this. Here's why you don't need to be angry with anyone. No one's really doing anything wrong right now. And lots of people are like, you're just rage baiting. You're just trying to get people stoked up and angry. It's like, that's literally the opposite of what I was trying to do. But anyway, people misunderstand. Maybe I didn't do a very good job of explaining. So let's try and do a better one here. Not trying to polarize you, not trying to win you over to my point of view. I'm trying to discuss an interesting and complicated topic. And that's it. And this video is a little bit less flashy. This is going to be a style of video where I'm very much talking to the camera. So let me know in the comments what you think about that. Do you prefer the ones like the voice acting one, where there's lots going on behind, you know, some Call of Duty zombies footage going on behind? Or do you prefer this kind of thing, where I'm just talking directly to you, and maybe we'll pop up a few things on the screen every now and then. So first of all, let's look at what the problem is. I'm sure you've seen some of these images before. They've been doing the rounds and they show the sort of weird art that generative AI creates at the moment and is being used in Call of Duty. This is live in the game right now. There's extra fingers, there's bits of images that don't really make sense, there's unrealistic poses. They're all the sorts of mistakes that AI-generated art makes all the time. And a real human artist probably would pick up on that stuff and fix it, or just not make those mistakes in the first place. People are understandably annoyed because not only are those images being used in a game that you've probably paid quite a lot of money for, but some of them are actually attached to bundles, with these being like specific items that evidently cost Activision very little, if not nothing to make, and then they're slapping them in a bundle that costs 20 quid. Now, I don't think anybody is buying these bundles because they want a particular loading screen. That's insane. But they're definitely being used to kind of add perception to the value of the bundle. You know, back when you were a kid and you get one of those like little bags of like treats and they've got like a couple of sweets in them and a little toy, and then you might get something that's like, you know, a postcard or some stickers or something like that. And those things are never important. You never cared about those things, but they were just in there to kind of add a bit of perceived value to them. That's what these loading screens and stuff like that are being used. You don't buy the bundle for them. You didn't buy the bag for the stickers. You bought them for the toy or the sweets. You're buying the bundle for the operator skin or the weapon blueprints, or in my case, usually the emotes. But these are just like extra fluff to kind of get you to buy it. So before we go any further, let's make it really, really clear what generative AI is, at least in this context, because it's a really vague term. And we'll get to that later about why I think it's really interesting how vague the term generative AI is. So in this context, generative AI involves putting a prompt or maybe some source imagery as a prompt into a computer program. You know, normally it's a web app. Think something like Midjourney or DALL-E, I don't know how you meant to say it. And then that program generates an image based on the prompt. The generative AI systems do this through a process called machine learning. So that's how they're kind of created, or that's how they're evolved. They study huge libraries of existing content, and that could be specific collections of licensed images. The company that's creating the AI model could license a bunch of images specifically for this, and that's probably how they should do it. Or more likely, it could just be general art that's available in the public domain. And obviously, when we talk about the public domain, even that's a thorny issue, because, if you find something on Google image search, that doesn't mean it's in the public domain just because it's publicly available. But clearly, some of these generative art models are just using basically Google image search. And that means that they're using things that they don't own the licenses for. And we'll talk about that later too. So they use all of these images, they sort of build up collections of them, and then they analyze the connections between the images and the tags and descriptions and the language that is used to describe them that's attached to those images. And they look for common factors. They're looking for patterns. Then when you type a prompt in, it passes that prompt for sort of keywords or ideas that it recognizes, and then it merges elements of the learned libraries together, all of those different images that it's analyzed, and it sort of merges them together to try and make something that fulfills the criteria of the prompt. The thing that separates these kind of new generations of generative AI from just a basic mosaic, if you type in a prompt into Google image search, you essentially get a mosaic that Google has created of, hey, this is what you're looking for, right? The thing that makes these different is that they're using evolving algorithms that are changing over time based on that machine learning to find connections I don't think people would necessarily normally think about, because it's just so much data being passed, so much data being used. So whether that's like composition or color, shapes, forms, lighting, it's compiled a huge number of examples, and it can generate something that doesn't really look like any one of the things that was fed into it, but is actually using subtle aspects of maybe like, a million different images to create the thing that you've said. A really important distinction between a human artist doing a similar process to this, seeing a brief and then sourcing a load of reference images using something like Pinterest or whatever, and then creating something new based on that brief and using all of those images that they sourced for inspiration. And what the AI is doing is that the AI doesn't understand what it's doing. It doesn't understand what it's looking at all. It doesn't know what the objects in the picture are, or how light works, or how physics work, or the relationships between different aspects of the image, or the significance of those aspects. It doesn't understand what it's doing at all. It just looks for patterns and copies them and uses them in different contexts. So, you tell a generative AI to make you a picture of a polar bear, and it will make you a picture of a polar bear. It doesn't know what a polar bear is. It doesn't know that a polar bear is a living thing. It doesn't know how a polar bear would move or how a polar bear would act or anything like that. Instead, it's just looked at lots of pictures of polar bears, and then it's been like, okay, these are the things that this has in common. I'm going to create something that also fulfills those criteria. Like, that's it. So that's why often AI will make weird mistakes and things, and it will do things that look impossible or things that look a bit wrong, because it doesn't actually understand what it's doing. This is why the whole term artificial intelligence is weird, because it's not intelligence in any meaningful way. It's an algorithm piecing together huge libraries of information and just trying to merge them together in a way that fulfills the criteria that we give it. Now, generative AI a few years ago, and I'm really talking about not many years ago at all, was terrible, just really bad. It would be incredibly abstract and nonsensical, but it stood out and it made headlines because it was actually quite impressive that a computer program could make something that looked new. It could create something that hadn't ever existed before. And that seemed to go against what we understood computer programs as doing. Normally computer programs would do the things that they were programmed to do. And in this case, that is still happening on a kind of very detached level. But it's creating something that, at least to our brains, looks like something we've never seen before. You could type in words into this and it would create a piece of, artwork. It would create an image that no one's ever seen before, and you hadn't expressly told it how to do it. So it seems like the computer was making decisions about composition and color and lighting and all of those kind of things. And often it would make surprisingly good decisions about those kind of things. Obviously, because it was based on human decisions, based on human artwork, but just in a way that was detached enough that we couldn't really recognize it. This idea of what is actually new is actually really, really important. There's been plenty of discussion and debate about the legality of training these models on things that the person who's training the model, the person who owns the model, the person who's selling licenses for this model, things that they don't own. You know, if you are training a generative AI on images that you don't own, that generative AI is going to create images using information from things that you don't own. And you're not really meant to be able to do that. There's lots and lots of laws to kind of stop you from just piecing together something that someone else has done and selling it as your own. So let's briefly talk about royalties. One argument, one side of this is that everything that an artist creates is theirs, and it's theirs alone. And anything that uses the artwork owes them compensation. So whether that's a computer program using that artwork, whether it's a big company using the artwork, whether it's an individual using the artwork, if you are using artwork that was created by an artist, you owe that artist something. And obviously, licenses can be bought and sold, companies can commission works, then the company actually owns the license. But generally, you have to pay royalties, and copyright laws exist to protect whoever owns the rights to that piece of art, whether that's the artist or they've sold those rights on to someone. And I'd like to flag up here, I'm aware I might be using the wrong word when I say copyright, trademark, licenses, all of that stuff can obviously get complicated and have specific meanings in law, but hopefully, from the context, you know what I mean when I say copyright. On the other hand, looking at it from a different angle, every artist, whether they're painting or creating music or writing novels or making video games, is inspired by other works of art and other artists. When I studied art way back in school, we spent most of our time learning as much as we can from the works of other artists, from famous artists, from well-respected artists. We'd be encouraged to do studies of them. So you'd look at an artist and you'd look at all of the work they did, you'd look at the things that inspired them, you'd look at their methods, their skills, the mediums they used, and you would learn to copy it. Like you would learn to sort of look at someone like Van Gogh, however you meant to say his name, and you would be like, okay, I'm going to sit down with some paints and I'm going to try and create something that looks like what he did to try and learn how he did it. We learned to imitate and emulate those artists, and we adopted elements of their skills and decisions into then what was our own work, the projects that we created. Writers and musicians do exactly the same thing. It's not unusual to talk about your inspirations very openly and how you developed your own style based on the people that you respect or admire. But do those people that you respect and admire, the people that influenced your work and essentially, indirectly trained you to do the things that you want to, do they get compensated for you learning to do their things? Lots of time, people might say, oh, well, you'd buy their books, you'd, buy prints of their artwork, or you'd pay museums hosting them. But do you really? Like people learning to paint now, do they not use Google Images and just look at art on there? Do people not use free resources in order to do all of these things? Did Green Day ask Stiff Little Fingers for permission to use them as an influence? Did Banksy send checks to Andy Warhol's estate because he had a style that was slightly inspired by him? Does J.J. Abrams pay for a license to use things that he learned from Steven Spielberg? No, of course not. It's just a common thing that artists learn from artists that came before them. That's just how that works. So how is a human being learning to create things based on the work of others all that different from an AI learning to create things based on the work of others? There's obviously got to be some line between what is copying and stealing and what is inspiration and what is learning. That's an important line to draw, and it's a line that's almost impossible to draw. It's impossible to do something that can't be argued against. For me, I'd say, and I was talking about this on stream earlier, a piece of art is new when it's near unrecognizable from its influences. If you look at something like the music of Oasis and you say, oh, okay, they are recognizable as in they've been inspired by bands like the Beatles, you can definitely see some connections between things they do, whether that's chord progressions or the way they're structuring their songs or the instruments they're using. But then you can't really say, like, if you listen to a Beatles song or you listen to an Oasis song, you'd clearly be able to tell which is which. It's kind of unrecognizable. You know, the Oasis songs are not recognizable as Beatles songs and vice versa. So say if someone took like The Scream by Edward Munch, you know, that painting, that was a really good impression, I hope. I haven't seen it back yet. And they just paint a mountain onto the background of it and then try to sell it. That's still The Scream, it's just had something added onto it. It's just been modified. So the person who's trying to sell it, you know, they're doing something wrong there. I don't know if The Scream is in public domain and you're actually allowed to do that. I've got no idea. Anyway, you wouldn't be like, oh, this is an artist who's created something new. You'd just be like, this is someone who's barely modified The Scream, probably made it worse, and is trying to pass it off as their own. That's a bad thing. But if somebody studied Edward Munch and The Scream, and then they learned the style and they learned the techniques that he used to create it, and then they created something themselves, maybe of a different subject matter, but using some of the same ideas, some of the same techniques, that's just taking inspiration, and I think that would be okay. And you could say, oh, this person was clearly inspired by Edward Munch, but they've created something new. So let's get back to Call of Duty. Is Call of Duty using generative AI in a way that is stealing from someone else? Not as far as I'm aware of. I haven't seen anybody suggesting, hey, this weird Santa with 5 fingers is clearly taken from this other artist. I haven't seen that. It seems like the generative AI work is at least new enough that it's not just copying from somebody else. There's a chance, and I think it is a pretty low chance, that Activision have their own in-house library. So their generative AI that they're using could have been trained purely on Call of Duty imagery. There are some actual practical benefits to doing that, like keeping an in-house style, making sure everything, you know, kind of looks like what came before. They might have done something like that to preserve that style. I doubt that's what's happened. They've probably used something much more generic, but it's definitely possible. But I don't think that's where people's problem with this lies. I don't think people are just saying, oh, this generative AI is bad because it's stealing from someone. The biggest 2 arguments I've seen about the generative AI, and this is going to be the focus of this video really, is first of all, it's bad. Like, it's bad quality for an expensive game. And then the second one, it's taking away work from real artists. You know, it is meaning that Activision don't have to pay real artists, and it would be better if they did pay real artists so those people could keep their jobs, keep their livelihoods, and we would get more high quality art in future. So let's talk about these one at a time. The first one, it's bad. Yes, it definitely sucks. Like, this artwork is just obviously bad. I don't think anyone's going to be like, oh, I wish I could print that off and put it up on my wall. It's just ugly. It's just bad. It's an ugly piece of art, and the mistakes in it, like the 5 fingers and stuff, just make it worse. I don't think they're like the main crime in it, really. I don't think they're what ruin it. It's just an ugly piece of artwork. And I wouldn't say this is really, in Call of Duty, a problem just with generative AI. There's some handcrafted artwork that have obvious mistakes in Black Ops 6, and they suck too. Like, there's this hilarious background image in the menus, and I assume that this was just a scene an artist created in Blender, and then they were moving it around, and rather than rendering out scenes properly, they decided to screenshot it and submit the screenshots as what was going to be used for the artwork. So it's got a bloody cursor in it. Like, you can see the mouse cursor. This is in-game right now. You can go into game and you can see this. I don't know when they'll fix it. I assume they will at some point. That's been used in game, and that's obviously not something that AI has created. That's just a mistake by a person. It is sort of low effort artwork. So not only did a human create it and then screenshot instead of rendering it and all of that kind of stuff, but actually the fact that it was used in the game and survived what I assume must be at least a few passes of like kind of quality assurance between somebody looking at it before they sort of code to put it in the game properly, and then people testing the game, and then the final sort of quality assurance before the game's released. It passed all of that and all of those people, and then got released to us with nobody noticing that it was there. Or at least if they did notice, they didn't care enough to change it. And I don't know anything about coding Call of Duty games, but I imagine changing a background image probably isn't the most difficult thing for them to do. That's why I assume they will patch it at some point. So while generative AI definitely makes stupid mistakes that makes art worse and makes some of the art that they've created bad, so do humans. So this seems to be the main complaint leveled at generative AI, that there are people out there typing a prompt into something like Midjourney, and they're using whatever it spits out as a replacement for art that otherwise could be created by artists using commissions. Someone, an executive, a producer, whoever, is making that decision that they need a piece of artwork. They could go hire an artist, and it's a long process of finding artists, commissioning them to do it, giving them the brief and everything like that, and then backs and forwards checking it until you're happy with it, and then spending a lot of money doing that. Or you can type into a prompt and then pick one of the things that the machine gives you. That's what's happening. And obviously when people do that, that it puts the artist's livelihoods at risk and devalues their work. Now, I'm super aware that what I'm going to say in this section is unpopular. But this isn't anything new. In the early days of movies, I go back to cinema, because it's something that I think a lot of people can understand. There were entire professions that people had as their livelihood, their main livelihood, that was based on difficult skills. So things like matte painting for backgrounds, and people, if you wanted a big landscape in the background of a Western, instead of going and filming it in Monument Valley or something, they could just do it on a Hollywood backlot and have someone paint something that looked realistic enough for the cameras at the time. They could just do a painting in the background. Or if you were doing a fantasy type thing, Wizard of Oz or something, you could do paintings of fantastical lands and have them in the background. And because the camera isn't, really perceiving depth anyway, that was fine. That would work. It would look good enough on camera. There was rotoscoping, so when people are having to do some compositing, they have to very, very carefully cut out exactly where the things that they want to keep in the image are, and then get rid of the backgrounds. And doing that by hand, frame by frame, incredibly difficult, incredibly time consuming, and something that required a lot of real skill. There are things like, working with physical film, people who were editing, actually having to cut up reels of film and stick them together and paste them together, and doing that in a way where you could make something that actually worked and all the timings worked and everything like that. And sort of things like special effects, so like stop motion effects, when they wanted things like Jason and the Argonauts, the famous skeletons, or if you wanted some big monster in something, having to use stop motion puppetry and miniatures for things like that. All of those people who did those jobs were artists. They were doing jobs that required huge amounts of skill and experience. There were whole groups of them. There were schools dedicated to teaching people how to do that kind of thing. And then they were paid appropriately for what they were doing. So some of the people who were doing those jobs, because it was a very difficult job, were paid a lot of money for what they were doing. And then over time, some of those problems, like how do you edit footage together, or how do you composite different shots onto one image, or how do you create fake backgrounds for environments that you're not really in, or fantastical monsters on screen, some of those problems were starting to get solved in different ways, like using digital tools, using computers. So for a long time, the old ways of doing things just looked better. When you used computers to do some of these things, they looked bad, they looked fake, they didn't age well, they looked rubbish, just kind of like what generative AI is a bit like now. But over time, people realized, well, even if they don't look as good, the new digital methods are cheaper, they're faster, and they look almost good enough. So maybe if your film was slightly lower budget, maybe if you didn't have access to the artists and the skilled people that you need, this was an alternative that was at least viable. And then eventually those digital methods evolved to the point where they actually looked better than the old ways of doing things. If you did a film that looked like Jason the Argonauts now, people wouldn't be able to take it very seriously, because you can animate things like skeletons moving in much more realistic ways than what they were doing then with the stop motion puppetry. Computer-generated backgrounds replaced matte paintings. You have things like The Mandalorian, where they've got that massive screen behind the actors that actually is showing in real time these 3D-generated worlds running in Unreal Engine 5. And the actors can actually react to things in them. It casts light on them properly. It can you can move the camera around a lot without and still have the parallax and everything. It works really well. CGI animation replaced stop motion puppetry. Digital editing was, replacing editing by hand. It was just much easier and faster to do digital editing, where if you make a mistake, you can easily go back and correct things. The new digital methods were not only still much cheaper and much faster, but they actually ended up giving the artists extra tools, extra opportunities, things that they couldn't do, things that weren't possible with the old methods. So the vast majority of directors and editors and producers started using these digital tools as kind of the default, and the old profession started dying out. Now, of course, there are still some old masters. There's still some people that make miniatures and some people that do stop motion animation. I'm sure there's probably people who can do rotoscoping and editing video by hand, and they can now charge a lot for their skills because there's not many people who can do it. And there's some situations where what they can do is still important. It's still something that someone values. But I don't see many people getting angry online that entire professions have been decimated in this way. You don't see people going out there saying that we have to go and defend the people who can edit film by hand. Why don't they get to work? Why we need to get rid of all of this digital editing. That would seem ridiculous now because while yes, it's kind of sad that these people spent a lot of time learning a skill and now they can't earn money doing it, that's just progress. Now, going back to generative AI, the same thing really did happen with digital art. For a while, all digital art was kind of physical art that was then scanned in, or, photography was used to try and get it onto a computer. And then tools advanced on computers and a new generation of artists started creating digital art because they were skilled at doing that. It was quicker and cheaper and easier to do than doing it physically and then scanning it in. So that just became the norm and that became a new profession. And now there's a new tool that's kind of replacing them. And it has a similar effect, and that's generative AI. And I think one of the issues with generative AI is that instead of creating a new profession, you're not going to get people going to university, I don't think, learning how to do prompts for generative AI. But instead, it's kind of created a point where you can get rid of that group of people altogether. Instead, you could have somebody who is, the director or the producer or the editor or whoever can now use that tool, cutting out the middleman. And that's probably where some people are finding it less easy to cope with or finding it less easy to accept. Now, production like Call of Duty requires an insane amount of art, like we said earlier. Think of how many textures, graphics, logos, fonts, icons, loading screens, backgrounds, 3D models, animations, environments. How many of those are there just in the base game of Black Ops 6? And then think about how often they release a new map, how often they release a new mode that might require new graphics and icons and everything, a new operator skin, a new weapon, blueprint, or a camo, and then those bundles that have, loading screens and all of that stuff in. I'd say, there's major content releases for Call of Duty every month, and then there's new bundle stores, probably 3 or 4 a week. That's a huge amount of content being created. And while there are a lot of studios working on Call of Duty, I think each of those studios is probably smaller than you think. I've always been shocked when I've seen some footage from inside the studios, just how small a lot of them are. The art departments that are working on these games aren't thousands of people. There's not, huge warehouses full of artists working on all of this kind of thing. And the artists that they are hiring have limits on how much work they can do. Over the last decade or so, there's been a real focus, and rightfully so, put on crunch, the crunch culture, people being overworked, people being given too much to do and not enough compensation for it, burnout in games development. And it gets much worse when you're working on a game with a live service model. It's not even, you're crunching for the year before release, and then you've got a little bit of time to sort of take it a bit easier. It's just constant crunch. That was a big problem with Fortnite when they started doing the battle passes and changing the map constantly, that the people working on all of this stuff were just constantly in a state of crunch, constantly expected to work long hours, being given unrealistic goals about how much they had to create, and they simply couldn't keep up. There's that constant treadmill of new content being released for a game like Call of Duty, and the audience, us, the gamers, constantly want more. We always want more of whatever they're offering us. So in Call of Duty specifically, there's always a demand for more zombies maps, more multiplayer maps, more Warzone maps, more weapons, more operators, more rewards in events and battle passes. I don't think there's much of a demand for more loading screens, but there's definitely a demand, for why isn't there a camo for this? Why isn't there a calling card for this? Why haven't we got a new Warzone map so far this year? Stuff like that. The executives, I suppose we did have a new Warzone map, Area 99, actually. And I kind of know who the art director is and that. So we should mention Area 99, did come out. The executives in Activision want to make as much money as possible for their shareholders and, I suppose for themselves indirectly. So they want more stuff to sell on the store, and they want more new features to advertise, more reasons for you to keep logging in and grinding to get that new camo or skin. And that means that eventually the ability for the artists who work at these studios, their ability to create the necessary amount of content is outpaced. They can't keep up. So what are the possible solutions for Activision? How could they possibly keep on generating more and more content, on a broader set of games with the artists they have? Well, the first answer is obviously they hire more artists. So, I'm sure there's lots of people like, well, common sense, pay more money, get more artists. Now, the average wage for a 3D artist in California, I just looked this up today, and California is where a lot of the studios are based, is $97,000 a year. That's the average. Obviously, more experienced artists earn a lot more. Less experienced artists will earn less. And then every member of the team you want to bring on, you're not just, committing, because it's probably like, a 1-year contract, 2-year contract. So you're committing to already $100,000, $200,000 for each artist. But then everyone you bring on requires more office space. They're going to require training. They're going to require management, people to organize it. You can't have like one art director dealing with like 1,000 different artists at once. Even if you can find enough skilled artists, enough people that are good enough to sort of meet the level that you require, all it takes is like one bad Call of Duty, one bad game, one bad year where you don't have enough money to pay for everyone. And suddenly you've got like this insane employment bill that you can't afford. You've got redundancies that you need to start paying. You need to start laying people off and destroying their careers. Some people will have like moved thousands of miles to come and work for you. And then you're suddenly telling them that you're not able to sort of provide a job for them anymore. You're going to have extra offices that you don't need, but you're still having to pay for. It's a huge risk for any development studio to bring on more staff. And we've seen it loads over the last few years. You've seen so many development studios that have grown loads, they've been acquired, or they've had one successful game, they've grown loads, and then a year or two later, they have, a bad game or they have some delays, and they suddenly have to lay off hundreds of staff. And that's obviously a terrible, terrible thing. So the second option is that instead of hiring new staff, you just outsource the work. And this is probably what happens the most, and it's led to a lot of the things that we've seen. We've already been talking about outsourcing. The work, instead of being done in-house in studio, is actually being given to other studios or independent artists. They have less oversight. They have maybe, a more of a temptation to cut corners to meet deadlines because they've got less kind of themselves invested in the projects. Activision have less control over the artists, particularly in terms of quality, and it's probably also more expensive in the short term. Normally in business, I think if you are outsourcing something and you're paying something as you have demand, so you're suddenly like, oh, we need to commission a bunch of artists to create this work right now, that probably costs more than if you already had your own artists doing it. The third option is that instead of hiring more artists or outsourcing it, is that you could just create less. You could just create less content. They could cut the workload for the artists by releasing less updates, committing to less stuff in the future. But obviously that's going to lower profits, and so that's bad for the shareholders, and it leaves money on the table, which the shareholders won't accept, because if there's people willing to pay for more content, but you're not producing it, you're essentially wasting money, you're wasting profit, and they lose goodwill with the community, because the community, we've all got used to having a new update every month and loads of new content, and again, it's easy to sit there and be like, oh, we wouldn't mind. But you already see the reactions when, they do a season reloaded update or something and there's not much in it and people are pretty angry and are like, oh, Call of Duty's dead, like this is over, I'm not going to play anymore. It's probably my favorite solution that they could just release less content, just do a game every other year. You don't need to do an update every month. But I think because that means losing money, essentially, not earning as much profit as they possibly could, it's probably not an option for them. So the fourth option is that they find ways to create the same amount of content or more content while also reducing the workload for artists, make it easier for artists to make content. And one of the ways they can do that is generative AI. Generative AI is a tool that allows them to create artwork very quickly. It can be then touched up or curated by real artists, but it requires way less work and effort, way less cost, and therefore kind of time as well. You're not having to tie up artists making all of that stuff. So you can kind of give some of the less important work maybe to generative AI, while the artists you do have and that you are paying are working on more important artwork, stuff that's going to be noticed a little bit more, or stuff that is more, crucial to the game experience. And so I think it's really easy to see where option 4 could be super tempting to a company like Activision. Of course, it has downsides. There's legal implications of generative AI. It still hasn't been sorted out how licensing and how the libraries that machine learning uses to learn from, like how they should be monitored and compensated and all of that kind of stuff. I don't think anyone can really predict which way that will go, or if it's even possible to kind of put it back in the box now. Now it's happening. Now these models already exist that have been trained on basically everything. Is there any way to go back and sort of say, no, you have to take this out of the model? I think probably not. And also, going back to what we said earlier, the art is bad. If they go for option 4, they use generative artwork, the art is bad. But, and this is quite an important but, the art is getting better. Early generative AI artwork was terrible, as we said earlier, and it took quite a lot of time to create, just in terms of, rendering time or whatever you want to call it. I don't know what you call it when you're creating something, generating time maybe. A few years after the beginnings of this, though, we're already at the point where sometimes it's hard to tell if something is AI generated or not. Especially if it's kind of low resolution or it's of something quite ordinary, it can be pretty tricky to tell whether something is AI art. I think there's a lot of images within Call of Duty that people don't know. People don't know whether all of them are AI art or not. And sometimes, right now, there's even videos that are quite hard to tell if they're 3D generated or if they've used generative AI to create something. When there are mistakes, it's funny, it's often glaringly obvious, but there's less mistakes than there used to be. I don't think it's insane to think that we're only a few months away from a lot of those problems being solved and generative AI artwork being indistinguishable in terms of, is this generative AI or not, from real artwork created by humans. Now, of course, in terms of quality, it's not just about mistakes and accuracy and whether or not you can tell it's generative AI. It's about like heart and soul and intention. And the AI cannot replicate that. It just can't. Or rather, it's really bad at it because it doesn't understand anything like that. It doesn't understand anything at all. It's just doing what makes sense based on the input. So there's no intention behind it. There's no passion behind it or anything like that. I'd personally argue that AI-generated art can still have an effect on you. It can still make you feel something. You can still look at it and think that it is beautiful or it is, sad or it's exciting or whatever. I think you can still have a reaction to AI-generated art, but there's no intention behind it. And there's kind of something less about AI art, about generative AI art, compared to art created by humans. With art created by humans, there's a feeling of connection to the artist and you trying to understand what they were attempting to communicate. With generative AI, that's missing. And it's something very nebulous and kind of hard to put your finger on with it. But there definitely is a feeling that it is less in some way. But is all of that intentionality and impact and emotion all that important in the sorts of art that we're talking about? How important is a sense of, is this art when you're looking at an icon in a video game or a background in a menu or an emblem or a sticker or a loading screen, which is what we've been looking at? What about a texture or a 3D model? When the producers are weighing up what's kind of good enough for what they're trying to achieve, when does AI art meet that bar? It's going to be different for everything. Something like a texture, if you've got a brick texture on the side of a building, you could probably get away with that being AI generated and no one's ever going to care. Whereas something like a loading screen that you're going to be sitting there looking at and it's kind of setting the vibe and the tone of the game, that's probably going to matter a little bit more, that it's not going to have that same feeling as a handcrafted piece of art. For me, though, at least, Call of Duty is full of bad art. Call of Duty is full of stuff that is ugly, pointless, shallow, a little bit cringy maybe, whether it was made by humans or AI. And it's never really bothered me that much. Sometimes I'll look through the store and just laugh at some of the ugly stuff that's in there. The Battle Pass is full of stuff that I would never want to use because maybe it's not to my tastes, or maybe I just think it's kind of ugly. They've hired some bad artists in the past, at least, that have created terrible or ugly pieces of art for their games, especially the cosmetics in the store, I think. That's where you see it the most. And they've also hired some great artists who have created really awesome stuff and stuff that's worth admiring. And I think it's kind of some people, when they're talking about this kind of thing, they act as if all artists are amazing and perfect and everything they create is very valuable, and then generative AI is all terrible. I think there is a big area in the middle where, for what that particular piece of art or that particular image needs to be, you can have human artists that are very bad at creating it. You know, if you said, okay, who's going to make a better image of, you know, a mountain with a forest and a lake in front of it, and it was me who can't do digital art against an AI, the AI would do a better job. I'm pretty sure the generative AI would do a better job. You would be able to sell what they created easier than you could sell what I've created. Now, there's probably still some inherent value in what I'm doing that the AI doesn't have, but depending on what you need the image for, it might not matter. So what I'm trying to say through all of this is that in a world where there are limited resources, but there is an ever-increasing demand for content, I can understand that if you're going to cut corners on creating artwork, there probably are places where generative AI could be used instead of human artists. And weirdly, we've accepted this for a long while in gaming, decades in gaming, and I can't really remember people kicking up a fuss before now. And this, I think, might shock some people. I think this is a thing that people aren't talking about enough when you talk about this, because people have this idea of generative AI being its own thing, being something separate and different. But think back to a lot of the most popular games of history, of, you know, the last, let's say, 30 years. In the second Elder Scrolls game, I've never played Elder Scrolls Arena, I don't really know what it's like, but in Daggerfall, the second Elder Scrolls game, some of you might know, a little bit of trivia, one of the biggest maps in gaming of all time. It's an open world game, and the map in it is bigger than Great Britain. Like, literally bigger than the real Great Britain. That's insane. Now, you don't actually explore most of that map in the game, but you can, if you want to. You can wander around and you will find towns and villages. You'll find little areas with different kinds of landscape, and it's all generated procedurally. So all the town names, the layouts of those towns, where the buildings are, the NPCs in those towns, the scenery, the places, the sort of roads between them, it's all created in a way that makes sense by a computer algorithm that's based on real patterns from real life, where the developers have kind of programmed that algorithm to then create something that at least looks realistic. You know, there will be roads that go to towns. The towns are joined up. There will be buildings near those roads, and there will be NPCs that hang around outside those buildings. All of that is stuff that feels like it makes sense, and it's not been placed by hand. They could have hired artists to do it, but they didn't, because they needed to create more than they possibly could with the artists that they had. Minecraft's worlds, although often considered quite beautiful, you know, people will often play Minecraft and be amazed at the worlds that are created when they load into a game. They're procedurally generated, and artists didn't make those worlds. They follow rules and algorithms that aren't that dissimilar from machine learning and generative AI. It's just a set of rules that have been crafted in such a way as to create something that makes sense, that will create mountains and lakes and caves and chasms and things like that. The entire galaxy of No Man's Sky, the enemies appearance in loads of open world video games where, you know, you have loads of different enemies spawn in and they all look a little bit different. They've all got different combinations of clothes and faces and hairstyles and things like that. Traffic patterns in games that take place in cities like Spider-Man, clouds in games, behavior of different races in racing games or enemies in, you know, first-person shooters, the animations in Grand Theft Auto, you know, when you push someone and how they grab onto stuff. All of this stuff is using tools to replace stuff that artists could have done. They could have hired artists to make all of those things. They could have hired artists to animate individual clouds, to create every planet in No Man's Sky, to create every animation that they need in Grand Theft Auto. But at some point they drew a line and said, this isn't worth it. We're going to create a tool that will make something that's good enough. Now, I can understand artists themselves being upset that they will have less opportunities for work as these tools get better. But this has happened all throughout human history, and I can't imagine it's ever going to stop. In my opinion, the key for artists who are worried about this kind of thing is to show that what they create is substantially better and more effective at whatever it's trying to do than the tools can create. If they can show that their work has value beyond what the tools are capable of, then people will be willing to pay for that. Not everybody necessarily, and not in every situation, but there will be a market for it if what they're creating is something that is useful or effective or important. And if they can't do that, if they can't create something that, has the perception of value, they'll be replaced by something that is just as effective, but much cheaper or faster or easier to work with. I don't think the nature of being an artist means anybody is entitled to have society pay for them. Now, I know this video is super long, but if you've made it this far, just indulge me for a second while I share an anecdote that changed my thoughts about all of this a very long time ago. When I was at university, way back, early 2000s, I studied English literature and I did a little bit of philosophy as well. I did a few units in philosophy. And one night I was at a house party and I was sitting on a sofa and ended up sitting next to this guy that I knew from some of the philosophy classes. I wasn't friends with him, but I kind of knew vaguely who he was. And he was doing that thing that lots of people do in their first year of university, where he was telling me all about his travels in his gap year and how amazing they were and how eye-opening they were. And he was saying that he'd visited India. And apparently, according to him, I don't know how true this is, there were some people in villages and towns in India that were philosophers. And all they did was spend all their time contemplating life. And apparently, the community thought this was a valuable and important thing to do, so they would provide for them. They would give them housing. They would give them food. They'd give them, energy, heating, whatever they needed. And so these people didn't have to work. They didn't have to contribute to society because their thinking about life, that was their contribution. That was the thing that entitled them to getting looked after, basically. And I was like, oh, cool. That's, kind of a different culture. I'd never heard about something like that. Kind of an interesting idea that society would put a value on thinking, on thought. Then he lost me in the next bit where he said he thought he should be like that. He thought that because he was a philosophy student, he shouldn't have to ever get a job, that he should, and he was being completely serious about this, completely straight-faced. I thought he was joking at first. He corrected me, that he thought he should be able to, once he finished university, just spend his time thinking about life, and the government or his community, local council, whoever, should pay him for that because he was doing something important, and so everyone else should give up some of what they've earned in order to support him doing that. Now, I want to make it clear, this guy was nothing special. He wasn't particularly clever as far as I could tell. He was just some rich kid, from a family that was very, very well off. He'd decided to do philosophy, kind of because he thought it was interesting. And he thought that his thinking was worth more than everyone else's. So everyone else should pay for him in order to be able to do what he wanted to do. He shouldn't have to get a job like everybody else. And my problem with that was that how was what he was doing benefiting anyone else? Why would anyone pay him when he's not doing something that was benefiting anybody else? That seemed really strange to me. And I think that's the position some people who are calling themselves artists are. There's some artists who are generally creating things that are valuable and things that are worth something and things that, they have earned their pay, their position in life by creating things that have value. But just because you call yourself an artist doesn't mean you're automatically entitled to that. You have to create something that's worth something. And if a generative AI tool can create something that is as good or better than what you're doing, then I don't see why someone should be forced to pay you for something that is worse. So while artists that can create something of value will always be fine, there'll always be a place for them, they won't and they can't be replaced by AI because they're doing something that AI can't do. They're creating true art. If you're just producing stuff that's as good or, maybe less good than what an AI does, and you're not worth the money that you're charging for it over what someone can get done by an AI, people are going to use that AI instead. It's another tool that has replaced a skill, and that's happened lots of times before, and it's going to keep on happening. Now, like I said at the start of the video, I don't want this video to be like polarizing to anyone or to make you think that AI is good or bad or anything like that. This is just about looking at that idea and the issues and how interesting and complex this whole thing is. I think there's some stuff that we haven't talked about here, like the idea in England we have the BBC, the idea that things don't have to be for profit. There's an inherent value in supporting artists, even if it can't make money, even if it can't provide some sorts of value to society. Maybe there's a reason we should force people to pay them. Maybe it is a public good to have artists existing. That's a very good argument. There's definitely some truth in that. And I also want to make it clear, I'm not immune to this at all either. There's already AI-generated videos, and I genuinely think it's a case of like months rather than years before there will be AI-created streamers and the sorts of videos that I make being made by AI based on a prompt. So when you go into YouTube, instead of searching for something and finding something that you want to see, and trying to find something that matches that, it will just create something that you want to see and you'll watch that instead. And then it will be my job to try and provide more value than that, to try and make you want to come see me, a real person, instead of whatever the AI generated is. And I might not be able to do that. I might lose a load of viewers who just want to see things that were specifically made for them. That's definitely a real possibility. It's something that I think about. But I do also think if that happens, I'm not going to be arguing, saying, oh, other people should be like fighting and arguing for my right to create videos on the internet. If you get your entertainment somewhere else and, you think that's better than getting your entertainment from me, all I can do is try to be better. So if you liked this video, don't forget to leave a like. If you dislike it, leave a dislike. And also let me know in the comments, what do you think about AI in gaming, particularly in Call of Duty? Do you think it has a place? Does it bother you? Does it affect your enjoyment of the game that there are some of these, loading screens and calling cards and whatever else that have been created by AI? Does it make you want to play the game less? Does it make you want to give Activision less money? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Let them know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you for the next one. Goodbye.